Hey, this is Dino, and I want to show you a technique that I use to determine the fault name to check for in a fault rule in an API proxy in development time. So I have a simple API proxy here. It does one thing. It's got one conditional flow. That is the flow that includes a policy to generate an access token and then assign a response. So the condition for that flow is a post/token. So when that happens, this proxy will run these two policies. The generate access token is very simple. It is a client credentials generate access token policy. And I've set enabled equal false for the generate response element, which just means if this thing is successful, then it will set context variables, which this proxy then uses in the output, in the assign message when the policy is successful. Okay, so it's very simple. It's just got that one flow. There's also a second flow that's unknown request. So anything that's not post/token will get an unknown request. And then we've got a fault rule. So if there is a fault at some point during the execution, then we run a separate policy called am-diags. And what does it do? All it does is it has a single assign variable statement that assigns the value of the context variable named fault.name to a different context variable, this one named assigned. You can choose anything, doesn't matter. The purpose of this is to be able to reveal the value of fault.name when a fault should occur. So let's see what this looks like at runtime. So I'll look for a command. This is a curl command that will invoke the /token. We'll send a post to /token for that API proxy. And I'm sending grant type equals client credentials, and I'm sending in a set of credentials which are invalid. I haven't shown it here, but it's that -u argument there that will send invalid credentials into the API proxy. So I've sent that in, and as expected, I get the invalid client identifier fault. And let's look at the trace to see what's happened. So the first thing was in the response, the API proxy runs the generate access token policy. It's extracting the credentials from the header, and they're invalid. And then processing goes into the fault flow, and we run the Apigee runs the am-diags policy. At this point, we can see that in the variables read and assigned section of the trace, we can see that Apigee is reading the fault.name variable. The reason we know it's a read is because there is no equal sign right here. The Apigee is also writing or assigning a value to a different variable called assigned. And the reason we know it's writing that is because there is an equal sign in this line. So what this does is just reveals what fault.name is. Unfortunately, Apigee does not print the state of every context variable for every step in a trace session. Only those variables that get read or written. And so that single assign variable policy that I showed you a little bit earlier causes this event to be emitted to the trace session. Thereby, we can see what that looks like. We can also see the body that was implicitly assigned by the OAuth policy, and that doesn't change. So all we've done is added this diagnostics policy so that we can see in the assign message. It didn't change the response at all. What can we do with that? Well, now what we can do is modify the policy, or sorry, modify the flow to include a fault rule that acts on that fault name. So that might look like this. So I hope you can see that. This is the condition, and you'll see I want that condition to apply to the as a child of the fault rule, not of the step, of the fault rule. And it's testing the fault fault.name variable, and it's looking for that specific value. That specific value is the value that I saw here in the trace with my diagnostics effort. Okay, so that's the value, and I want to run this policy. Okay, and what is the content of that policy? I'll set that up to be like this. So it's an assigned message. It's just setting the payload, the status code, and the reason phrase. And the payload is a generic invalid client ID message. This is something that I put in. Okay, now remember, originally I see this message, and that is implicitly assigned by the OAuth policy. That's the default message. What we wanted, and we see a 500 and an internal server error message. We don't want that. We want to override that. That's what this policy is doing, this assigned message. You'll notice I'm not calling raise fault. And the reason for that is because in the flow, this assigned message is running within the context of a fault rule, which means a fault has already been raised. I do not need to raise a fault. The fault has been raised. The name of the fault that's been raised is invalid client identifier. All I'm doing is overriding the response, body, status code, and reason. Okay, so at this point I want to deploy this. What I do is I edit things offline. So you're seeing this in a text editor. And then I use a tool to import and deploy that API proxy into Apigee. You could do the same thing with the interactive editor inside Apigee. The result is the same. What we get is a new revision. So if I now refresh this page, you'll see the revision 6 is what I was working on. That was the latest. Now I have revision 7, and if we click over to the Develop tab, you'll see my fault rules are a little bit different. Now I have this invalid client thing. It's testing the fault name, and there's my invalid client policy. Okay, so that's imported. It's deployed. Let's start a trace session, and we will clear the screen and run the same request that we did before, where we're sending invalid credentials. What has happened? Well, now you can see a totally different response. Instead of a 500 internal server error and the default fault message that I get, instead I get the error message that I codified in that assigned message policy. The error is a Boolean that takes true, and then I have a simple message that just says invalid client ID. If I go over to the trace, I can see the same fault is occurring, and now we're running this fault rule. And this fault rule, remember, is the one that tests fault name equals invalid client identifier. Okay, let's suppose we have a different sort of fault. Let's suppose we have a fault where I'm sending the credentials, let's say valid credentials. Creds2 are valid credentials. And when I send a valid credential, I get an actual token, an issued at, and an expiry. That's all good. But let's suppose I break that in some way and I don't send the required grant type form parameter. What does that look like? Again, that's a fault. So in the proxy, you'll see this most recent request. It is the OAuth policy is again generating a fault. The fault name, the fault rule, the test for invalid client ID is not being triggered. So again, we see the diagnostics policy, and it's telling me, oh, fault name is invalid request. So I could now add another stanza in here testing for that fault name. Fault name could be invalid request. And here I might have a different policy that overrides it. Rather than invalid client, it might be named invalid request, and it might have a different payload. It's up to me to set that assigned message policy in the way that I want. And then if, again, if I run a good request, I'm going to actually get the access token, and that's shown here. So no fault rule processing here. We just use the assigned message for the good response, and it just sets the access token, the issued at, and the expiry. So that's my technique for using an AssignMessage policy inside a fault rule for diagnosing which fault name I need to check. So what you'll want to do is, if you use this, it's good for development time. Have a policy that just assigns fault name to a different context variable. You'll be able to see that when you turn on trace. That will reveal the fault name you actually have to test for in your fault rules. And those fault rules should fall, if you keep the diagnostics step, it should have, that fault rule should have no condition. So no condition here. And it should be first. The one with the diagnostics AssignMessage should be first in the list of fault rules, and your other fault rules with conditions should fall after. And the condition in those fault rules should apply as a child of the fault rule, not as a child of the step. Be careful of that. Both are valid, but that's not what the one that you want is fault name in as a child, direct child of the fault rule itself. Okay. That is it. That's it for today's tip. I hope this helps. Take care and stay safe, everyone.